FBAR, FATCA, acronyms that cause panic to foreign-born individuals. Should you be concerned about them? And we are back with another shorty. And in today's shorty, which we are calling What is English for FBAR and FATCA, we're going to talk to you about what these acronyms are, why you should be concerned about them, and maybe even talk about the penalties if you don't comply. Manasa, talk to me about it.
Oh boy, if I had a penny for every time a client called me in panic because they got an e-file acceptance from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, I would be a rich girl. You and I know this, but let's remind our listeners that FinCEN is an acronym for Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a bureau of the U.S. Department of Treasury that is in charge of collection and analysis of information about domestic and international financial transactions in order to keep an eye on money laundering or, worst, terrorist financing and other financial crimes.
Okay, so to comply with this Bank Secrecy Act rules and regs stands for regulations, one must file a FinCEN Form 114, commonly known as the FBAR, FBAR, okay? And this generally applies to people that have accounts at a financial institution located outside the US. So literally think like a bank account located in another country. And the thing we always want to caution people about is the key number for FBAR. And I know people come to us all the time and say we don't have this much money, is any of your bank accounts hit 10K for the year, even one day, then you do need to file the FBAR form. And here's the other key thing. If you have, let's say, 2 bank accounts in different countries, it doesn't matter, but the total one day hits 10K, then you need to file an FBAR for that year. Now, your account do not have to be producing any taxable income, right? So there's no taxes that come from the FBAR filing. All you're doing is just reporting, letting IRS know that you've got this bank account in a country outside the US. So now that we know what the FBAR is, Manasa, do you want to just go into FATCA?
Oh, yes. But before I go to FATCA, I just want to remind our listeners that the FBAR form that Jane was just talking about has to be electronically filed on that FinCEN website. You cannot send it in on paper anymore. So that's something that you need to remember. Now, yes, FATCA, differently and sometimes very funnily pronounced in many different countries, but we are just going to call it FATCA, FATCA, stands for the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. This was enacted by Congress in 2010. And again, this was to make sure that taxpayers who may have been using foreign accounts to hide their assets, that the government knew about those assets, right? So the passage of FATCA required not just individuals, but also foreign financial institutions to report information to the IRS about financial accounts held by U.S. taxpayers or by U.S. and foreign entities in which the U.S. taxpayers had substantial interest. So this was more far-reaching than the FBAR. And how did they achieve this? They achieved this by entering into intergovernmental agreements or IGAs with many countries.
And so basically, FinCEN and FATCA were looking to achieve similar objectives, but obviously the reporting is to different agencies. And this is something Manasa and I are constantly writing about on LinkedIn, on Substack, and on our blogs. Now, Manasa, you know what the number one question I get from clients and prospects on this, people will come to me and say, oh, I have this account, but IRS will never know. So how does IRS know that you have this account overseas? And you just alluded to it about the intergovernmental agreement. Let me give you a very practical example of how they know. They know because your bank at home told IRS. And before the recording, I was just telling Manasa, I have to do this because my bank in my home country just sent me a bunch of paperwork saying, hey, as a US tax resident, we require to have you complete these forms with them, their forms, because if you don't, we're going to cancel your account. And you're like, really? But the reason they end up doing that, because if they don't report to IRS, and I know they've already reported me to IRS, they're liable to pay something like, I think it's up to 30% of some of these accounts. So the bottom line is, don't try to hide. Just report. They already know. It's like, think of like a school principal, you've done something, or your parents, and it's like, just go talk to them. You've already done, you already know you've done this thing, or you have an account. Vanessa, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's kind of funny. I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also, you know what? There is something called the know your customer thing that most banks are subject to anywhere in the world for that matter, really, right? And under those know your customer, they have to get all of this information from you before they can even allow you to open a bank account. So on the one hand, the bank is collecting all this information. And as soon as they know that you have something to do with the US, under the FATCA, they have to send all this information to the US or the IRS. So suffice it to say,
They know.
They know. And therefore, these are two really important forms to file for those who are US citizens, green card holders, or tax residents of the US. So even if you're here on a work visa, but if you're a tax resident of the US, you have to file these forms. And of course, it goes without saying, if you're a US citizen or a green card holder, no matter where you live, you have to file these forms if those thresholds are crossed. So knowing what we know thus far, the FATCA has been around, just a little bit of history, right? If you're a history buff, and Jane and I are, we love to dig into stuff. Aside, you would catch us at a museum, like looking stuff up. Yeah. But when the FBAR has been around, believe it or not, since the 1970s. I believe, though, maybe the compliance was not the way it is right now, and not much was enforced back then. But FATCA comparatively is quote unquote fairly new. So the enforcement has really been just, 2010, maybe about 10 or 15 years now. So what we do when Jane and I work with our clients is we have an intake questionnaire which walks the client through a lot of these reporting requirements, because we like to gather this information and make sure that our clients or prospective clients do not miss reporting anything if they qualify. So that's what I do. And I know what you do, Jane. But is there anything else that you could think of that maybe, there are forms to file and the way you gather information?
So what I now do, and I've made it a point of saying whether somebody becomes a client or not, when I meet a prospect, I bring this up. So as part of my intake process, I'll ask them, do you have assets overseas? And if they say yes, when we talk the first time, I know it's supposed to be, we're trying to figure out if we can have a relationship. I'll say to them, if nothing else, the one thing I want you to take away is to understand about the FBAR and the FATCA. So have you been filing this for your overseas assets? And I think when I think about the percentages, Manasa, half of the people that I talk to haven't been filing these forms, or they've been filing some and missing out on some because they did not know. So what I'll say is, let's make sure, if nothing else, whether you work with me or not, you actually get this taken care of. And so far, I know people have said they're very thankful for that kind of information. But then now you've talked about who's supposed to file: US citizens, green card holders, and tax residents in the US. Okay, Manasa, what about those who've moved overseas and they're still US tax residents?
Yes. So if you have moved overseas, but you are a US citizen or a green card holder, you're still liable to file these forms. The FBAR form threshold is really low, actually. If you think about it, it's $10,000, which means that if you live abroad and you're conducting life abroad, that $10,000 is nothing, right?
Yeah,
So you're liable to be hitting that amount pretty quickly. So, yes, mostly people who live abroad would have to file that form. FATCA, now FATCA thresholds are different. FATCA thresholds not only kind of depend on whether you live in the US or you live abroad, but they are also dependent on how you file. Like if you file single, those thresholds are different. If you file jointly, those thresholds are different. And we will put these thresholds down for you for reference in our show notes for sure. But
perfect.
yes. But before we go down any further, though, the one thing, and maybe this is the other next big question that we need to address when we're talking about FBARs and FATCAs and for all that, is what do you do when you have forgotten, like Jane was just mentioning, or you have missed reporting some foreign financial assets? So the clients ask us this all the time, right? As soon as they come to know they
Yeah.
haven't, then what do I do now? So there are amnesty programs that can be used. And I don't know, people don't like to hear that word amnesty, but it is what it is. It helps you come into compliance. Then there are many different types of amnesty programs, and there are different set of threshold rules for if you live abroad or if you live in the US. And those are streamlined filing, delinquent filing, and all of that. So the thresholds, again, are different. The penalties are different if you lived in the US and you misreported or you lived abroad. On a side note, though, there has been a court case which is kind of encouraging. It's Bittner versus United States in February of 2023, where the US Supreme Court held that the $10,000 penalty for non-willful failure to file the FBAR accrues per report and not per account. Let's break that down really quickly because this is a shorty. There are penalties for not filing and therefore the amnesty programs, right? So going back, if you haven't filed and you decide not to file at all, then obviously you can't be our client anymore. But then also, you are facing these penalties for non-compliance. So some court cases like this kind of mitigate what you might end up paying as a penalty. But you know what? I wouldn't bank on that so much. I would start to work with an expert right away to make sure that those accounts are in compliance with the FBAR, FinCEN, or the FATCA.
So I think what you're saying, because I kind of want to end this on a positive note,
Yeah,
a
let's
lot
do
of
that.
people, yeah, don't know about the FBA and the FATCA forms and the requirements and the numbers at which you need to report. And IRS knows this. So when we talk to people and they haven't been reporting, all is not lost. You have a chance to rectify things. But once you know that you need to rectify, and this is what Manasa just talked about the streamlined filing. Oh, and we actually have an episode that talked about what this streamlined filing is that we're going to link to this. So once you know you need to have been filing, it's okay. You can come into compliance. There could be a little bit of a penalty to pay for it, but you have an opportunity to fix things and be tax compliant. So all is not lost. There's still a lot of hope for you. Okay. And
Yes.
anything else you want to add, Manasa, or we're good to go?
Yes, let's conclude by saying that it's very important as soon as you come to know that you had foreign assets that needed compliance, but you didn't do it, then ASAP, you need to get on that boat. And if you don't, there are very heavy penalties involved. And last but not the least, you really need to be working with a professional who knows what they're doing and get this show on the road, for the lack of a better term.
I think what you said is enough. So get
Yeah.
into compliance. So I think we're good to go.
Yes. And thank you for stopping by. And thanks for listening to this shorty. And until next time, bye.